Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Lynn O'Hara. I'm the National Director of Programs at National History Day, and we are thrilled that you came to spend your Tuesday evening with us. What I'd like to do for our second Google Hangout in our series of 5 is introduce all of our website students to the guests who will be joining us this evening. First off, I'd like to say welcome to Sarah Ashbrenner, who's our co-coordinator in the state of Minnesota. I'd like to say hello to Mrs. Dawn Crone and her students at Brownsburg High School out in Brownsburg, Indiana. Ms. Nicole Roper at West Catholic High School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we have a group of 6th graders joining us from Mr. Stacy Sato's classroom at Our Lady of Mercy School out in Daly City, California. We are thrilled that you joined us and are hoping that this is an activity that you will interact with. Throughout, at any point in this hour, please tweet your questions. The hashtag is NHDHangouts with an S on the end. I have a computer here and are monitoring the questions. I'm going to ask as many of your questions live to our expert, Dr. Louise Lippincott, as we can this evening. So at this point, what I'm going to do is turn the agenda over to Karen Kenton, who's a Senior Program Officer in NEH's Division of Public Programs. Thanks, Karen.
Hi, thanks so much, Lynn, and thanks to all our guests for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words about the NEH. The National Endowment for the Humanities is a federal agency that was created in 1965 because Congress recognized that history matters. NEH funds research, preservation, and education in the humanities. And by the humanities, we mean history, literature, philosophy, among other fields of study. NEH also funds the sharing of humanities scholarship and ideas through digital and public programs. NEH has supported History Day since its founding. We continue to support the first place NEH Scholar Medals at the national competition, and we offer a cash prize for creative and effective use of Chronicling America. And that's across all National History Day submission formats. Chronicling America is a free online database which includes over 6 million digitized public domain historic newspaper pages. And you'll also find educational resources developed by NEH's EdCitement team. As Lynn mentioned, I work in NEH's Division of Public Programs. We fund projects that turn rich, well-vetted scholarship into meaningful programming for public audiences. We seek projects that are engaging, thought-provoking, and include excellent storytelling devices across all platforms. Formats our division funds may sound very familiar to History Day students. They include museum exhibitions, nationally broadcast documentary films, digital projects such as websites, apps, games, including the website featured tonight, the Teenie Harris Archive and website, which was developed by the Carnegie Museum of Art and curated by tonight's special guest, Dr. Louise Lippincott. NEH is proud to support Teenie Harris Photographer, An American Story. Harris's photographs document a vibrant African-American urban community during the Jim Crow and Civil Rights eras. The archive of nearly 80,000 images is one of the most detailed and intimate records of the Black urban experience known today. We are very fortunate to have Louise Lippincott with us to share her expertise. Dr. Lippincott has degrees in art history and European history and has worked her entire career as an art museum curator. She's especially interested in ways images like paintings, prints, drawings, photographs represent the life of the past, whether 500 years ago or just yesterday. Dr. Lippincott, why don't you start us off by discussing some of the challenges historians face when working with images?
All right. Here we go. Images present two special challenges. The first one is you have to figure out what did an image mean to the person who made it or the person who owned it. And then secondly, how does an image communicate these meanings to people today who often live under very different circumstances in a very different world? So it's understanding the original purpose of the image and then understanding how to relate it to present life. And that can be quite challenging. Digital media such as websites offer historians amazing new ways to work with images, to tell stories or to present new ideas, and to really draw millions of potential users into the life of the past. And that's why I am so excited about this new method of communication with images.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can you tell us a little bit about your archive and the website that goes with it and how you came to build the website in the first place? You have this collection of photographs.
Right.
How did you decide what to do with them?
Well, we had a big problem. We bought this archive of 80,000 photographic negatives from a wonderful photographer in Pittsburgh. And they all arrived in the museum in about 20 cardboard boxes with no information attached. And so the big problem we had was how do you show these negatives? They weren't even prints to all the people who could tell us what they were about. And the only answer was to make digital images from the negatives and put them on a website and encourage people to tell us what the subjects were. And that's what we did. We started off with about 3,000, and we've worked our way up to 72,000.
Wow. So much like our students, you start off with an idea and a product, and you've got a good idea. Can you talk a little bit about how you go from an idea to kind of planning a website and the steps involved in planning from your end?
It's a long process, and of course I work in a big organization where many people had to be involved. But to reduce it to the basic elements, the first thing you have to do is you have to have a reason to make the website. In other words, why are you doing this? What is the goal? We were trying to solve a problem and get information. Lately, the purpose of our website has changed. We want to share the information we've collected. But figuring out what the website is supposed to do is the first big challenge. And then a long process that for us involves writing about it. You know, what's this? Writing down the story or the narrative or the problems. And then I have a huge bulletin board in my office. And once we get past the written story, we start putting pictures up on the bulletin board and moving them around. And eventually the pictures fall into some kind of an order that makes sense to everybody, and that our IT guy says, I can make that work on a website. So there's a long process. It's like making a movie. There's a lot that goes into it before you start rolling the film.
So once you have a sense of, okay, these images are going to go on this particular page, and you've got a sense of organization, how do you decide where to break your pages up? Because that's something that a lot of History Day students who build websites have to figure out. Because the first thought sometimes when they do a website is it looks like a paper on the website page,
Right,
where it's all on one, and they figure out that they have to chunk it. How are some ways once you have a subset that you build the page?
Well, I tend to think of something that you write on a page as very flat and two-dimensional. And a website can be three-dimensional. You can have layers. And our website is designed in layers so that people who want a sort of quick overview can enjoy the first layer of it. And then people who get curious and want more information click on images to get to the next layer, which is rich with information. People who continue to be intrigued can then move on to a third layer, which is about different ways of browsing groups of images into subjects. And so we try to, I think of it as layers.
Okay. Obviously your specialty is photographs.
Mm-hmm.
When our students encounter a photograph and they go, oh, this connects to my project, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of questions they should ask themselves in looking at and analyzing the photograph?
Ooh, photographs can be really tricky. And if you make the photograph yourself, then you know exactly what went into making it. And on our website, we are very careful to show the photographs in as close to original state as possible so people know they're seeing the photographer's actual work. Almost every other image these days, especially digital ones, you have to ask yourself, where did this image come from and what's been done to it since it got online. And so those are hard, tricky. But so looking at the thing very carefully, figuring out whether it has been edited, cropped, whether colors have been altered, things have been photoshopped in or out, are all important to know about before you decide to use an image as a piece of evidence for an argument.
Okay. If I'm a student and I find a photograph, what are the steps that I need to go through so that I can responsibly and appropriately take that photograph, let's say from your archive, and put it in my website?
Right. Well, there are two basic things that every photograph like that should have with it. One of them will be the name of the artist, the credit line for the artist. And the other thing will be the owner of the copyright or the owner of the image. For the Teenie Harris works, we require that it credit Charles Teenie Harris as the artist. And then copyright Carnegie Museum of Art is also necessary. Those are the bare minimum. If you're taking the image from a book or from another website, then you also need to give the bibliographical reference or the URL for the website and the date you downloaded it.
Excellent. So for our NHD students, they would credit it where the photograph appears, but then also in their annotated bibliographies at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how you tell a story in a website? How is it you get your readers to go to understand who Teenie Harris was and what he did and why he was important?
That's okay. We try not to use a lot of text. The wonderful thing about websites is that you can tell a lot of stories simply with sequences and combinations of images. So we put a lot of attention into making sure that our image sequences and relationships are very, very meaningful. And then we make sure that the text is minimal but is sufficient to identify the subject, the date, and someone looking at the sequence of images and reading the text will be able to understand and see for themselves what the connections are. So we actually ask our users to do quite a bit of thinking and creative work as they go through the images. We do not use a lot of words, and we try to leave space for users to draw their own conclusions.
Okay. One of the things that we see in NHD websites is that students will have a set of photographs. Mm-hmm. How do you know, and this is a live tweet question, how many images is a good number, how many is too many to put on any one page in a website?
Oh, that's a tough question because for me, at least personally, more is more. And the great thing about the websites and internets is that you can have thousands and thousands of images, which was never possible before. So it's a hard question for me to answer. I don't know exactly what the scope of these pages are. So I don't have a good answer for that one.
Okay. One of the issues that students sometimes will do is they'll plop a picture on their website without giving it any context. Can you talk a little bit about a good way, in a brief amount of time, let's say 2 to 3 sentences, how to give a photograph context so that the viewer who hasn't seen the original source and all of the other pictures that you chose from would know what they need to know to understand a photograph?
Okay, you need a really good caption, first of all. And secondly, you need to explain the point of view that made you select it. You selected this photograph because it shows the following thing. Those are the two, I think, key things to have. With the Teenie Harris archive, where we try to explain a little bit about his life, a little bit about Pittsburgh, the city he worked in, and a little bit about what a documentary photographer was trying to do in the middle of the 20th century. So there's some historical background. There's this accurate caption, and then your perspective are sort of three different contexts. They're all important.
Well, and I think that perspective piece is really key.
Mm-hmm.
Our theme this year is rights and responsibilities in history. And if I could jump really quickly to our Minnesota coordinator, Sarah Ashbrenner, can you talk just really briefly about rights and responsibilities and ways that a student could provide, as Dr. Lippincott said, that historical interpretation or perspective with any document that they're using in their website?
As related to the theme?
Yes.
I think that what the key for really a successful use of the theme is more than just using the words willy-nilly in a website, but to really think fundamentally how the ideas behind the theme connect to your topic. And so I think that once you've come up with your argument, figuring out a way to weave rights and responsibilities into that makes it even more effective. And I think then what you're going to do is look at those images, look at documents or newspaper articles to see how they support your argument, right? Because for a lot of History Day websites, the illustrations are more than just pretty. They need to be that evidence that you need to support your thesis. And so I often encourage our students to think of themselves as a lawyer. A lawyer doesn't just talk in a courtroom, they bring in witnesses. And in the cases of history, our witnesses might be photographs, our witnesses might be newspaper articles. And so that's the relationship I'd like them to remember.
Great. Dr. Lippincott, before we go to our student questions, and I'm getting some questions tweeted, please remember, if you're out there, hashtag NHD Hangouts. We're excited to see your questions. Can you talk just a little bit about the revision process? This is a challenge for all of our NHD students. Can you talk about how you do it at the Carnegie Museum of Art and how your webpage has changed over time?
Yeah, it's a brutal process. There's a constant feedback loop, especially in the developmental phases. I work with our IT guy who talks to me about what's possible in terms of technology. Our education department has strong feelings about the best way to communicate with a variety of different audiences. We work with a panel of community and academic advisors who make sure that we get our facts straight. And they will get the initial idea, they will see the storyboard, they will look at a couple of the early test versions of it. And then we collect feedback from the users. How many people visit this site? How many people come back to it? How many contribute useful information to our archive? And they're often quite frank about what we could do better. And this Teenie Harris website is now 10 years old, and it has changed a lot, and it is about to go through another big change as we look for ways to incorporate our audio files, which so far aren't there.
Excellent. As we're getting ready to jump to our first school, I have to ask you a question that just came in on Twitter. Do you need to caption every image? From an archivist point of view, what would you say to that?
Absolutely. Yes. If you don't have a caption, if you don't know enough about it to write a caption, it shouldn't be on there.
Excellent. Okay, at this point in time, I'm going to shift the focus to Our Lady of Mercy School in California. We have some students there with some questions from Mr. Sato's class.
Say hi.
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 Okay, Maddie has the first question.
All right. What's the best way to enhance the home background?
I'm sorry, Mr. Sato, can you repeat the question? It didn't come through clearly.
She said, what's the best way to enhance the home background?
That's a good question. One of the things our students have to figure out is how to set a background that enhances what they're doing and doesn't distract from what they're doing. Can you talk a little bit about how you make those choices when you're doing web design?
We try to keep our web design very simple and uncluttered, because we wanted the emphasis to be on the images themselves and not on all the sort of decorations surrounding them. So we selected a very simple typeface. We worked with 2 colors, and we put most of our energy into getting the best possible reproductions of the images themselves available, because you really want the focus to be on the content and not on the decoration.
Excellent. What's another question from your class?
This is Patricia.
So I have this primary source document, and I was wondering, how do you put it on the website, because it's paper, and how do you scan it?
That's a good question. What are some ways if a student finds something that's original? It might be a piece of paper, it might be something they found in their grandparents' attic. What are some good ways to create a digital image that's of a good quality? What's some options available to students?
Well, the two techniques we've used for Teenie Harris have been scanning and digital photography. And the bad news is that the better your equipment, the better your scan. And that's expensive. So again, my emphasis would be on getting access to the best possible equipment you can. What you have at home in school these days is pretty good now. And then just try it till you get it right. We've had to do some of our scans. We've had to do 4 or 5 times over again, and I recommend going for a really good scan rather than trying to make a bad one look good.
So there's lots of ways using digital cameras, using scanners. Sometimes, depending on the document, using photocopiers can give you a good basic scan. And a lot of times, sometimes your teachers are pretty good at helping it with you. They tend to be photocopy experts. Excellent. What's another question from Our Lady of Mercy?
This is from Gio and Emmy. They're in the same group.
Okay.
How can you tell if a picture is a primary source or secondary source?
That's a great question, and that's one that we've gotten in. When you find an image, how do you know if it's primary or secondary?
Well, I think if you take a photograph out of your grandparents' photo album, that would be a primary source. You'll be the first person to use that image, and it's probably never been published before. If you're going to be scanning something out of your history textbook, that is secondary. So it's really about whether you've found this image and you're using it in its basic form and not as it's been reprinted or reused by someone else.
That's a great question. Let's do one more question from Our Lady of Mercy, and then we're going to shift to some of our high school students.
And this one is from Joshua.
What would you call a great website?
Huh.
Oh, that's a great question.
I spend a lot of time on websites because they're so useful, and the websites I like the best are the ones that have the best information. There are an awful lot of websites with lots of opinions, lots of ideas, and the information is, but the hardest thing to find on the web for me is really good information that I can trust. And those are the websites I keep going back to over and over and over again.
Excellent. All right, let's shift just a moment. Let's shift to West Catholic High School in Philadelphia. What kinds of questions do you guys have for Dr. Lippincott?
Okay, I think we've got a couple of questions that hopefully we can get everybody to participate. Go ahead, guys.
Okay, first question. Is it okay to put the website in a different language if it associates with our topic?
Yeah. I think that the more original language you have, the better. I think it gives, again, this is one of the things you can do on a website you can't do with other media, so it's a great use of the technology. You will have to make sure that there is a translation available for those of us who only speak English.
Okay, thanks.
But I think it's a really powerful addition to a site.
All right. Okay.
We're starting to see more and more sites in bilingual for different reasons. I spoke with a teacher out in Nevada whose students are working bilingually in Spanish and in English to learn, and they're doing their NHD projects that way this year.
That's a neat way to do it. I think we've got one for Rob.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
My question is, how much focus should we put into the design of the website, and if we put videos, how long should they be?
Okay, why don't you talk about the design question, Ms. Lippincott, and I'll talk about the videos.
Okay, as I say, I can't stress enough the design should not interfere with the content. The videos should you should be a strong editor. You show enough to make your point and to represent the actual content of the video. In other words, editing to change the meaning isn't okay. But I do find that on websites people have very short attention spans. So you want to grab them with and get the basic content across without too much other stuff getting in the way.
NHD Rulebook is going to help you do that. You are going to be required to limit any video clips to 45 seconds. What that means is it's going to force you to choose the most important part. I'll give you one warning as a former NHD teacher. Resist the urge if you have a 10-minute video clip to do 45 seconds, then cut to the next 45 seconds, then the next one, then the next one. Think about yourself as the viewer of the website. You're not going to sit and click 10 video clips in a row. You want the 2 or 3 that are the most powerful and the most important.
That's right.
Excellent.
Any more, guys?
One more question?
We have one more from Monica back here.
What would you do to put on the website to grab attentions to like the people?
To grab attention, to really grab the attention of what you're trying to promote in your website is what they're asking for.
Yeah, especially on the first page. That's something our students try to struggle with. I get questions a lot about, well, what should I put on there? What are some suggestions you might have for our students?
You often try to start off with a call to action, which is basically with us, it's help us. Tell us about these images. Help us make sense of this. It's an invitation to someone who's just entered the website to get involved, and we try to encourage the user to be an active participant in the process and not just a passive click, 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 click. So we like to start off with a call to action of some sort.
Okay, and that's kind of a great way for our students to use their thesis statement to make their point to get your reader's attention early. I love it. These questions are being tweeted in. Let's go ahead and bounce to Brownsburg High School in Indiana, and then we'll take some of our live Twitter feed questions.
Great.
Okay. Well, you've already answered quite a few of our questions so far, but we do have one. Our question is, do we need to include in-text citations in our website?
Can I punt that question for a second to Sarah, our coordinator in Minnesota?
Hi there. Sorry I had to leave. We had an actual fire alarm, and it's with wind chill -17 out right now. So I'm very glad to be back inside. As far as in-text citations on the website, I think that the better method would be to include those credits. And so when you're using an image, you're using a video file or something, you are crediting where that comes from. Your full citation is going to be in your bibliography, which once again has to be on your website as well.
Excellent. So the idea is you're citing information as it comes, but then the full information and the full citations go in the annotated bibliography at the end.
Okay.
What other questions do you guys have in Indiana?
Well, we had quite a few, but I think you've answered the majority of them, so I don't think we have any at this time.
Okay. Well, we might jump back to you if you think of any. Get our attention. One question that came in earlier was, what makes you, Dr. Lippincott, spend time on a website versus kind of brush by it and move on to something else? What gets your attention when you're surfing the web?
As I say, good information and lots of it. So I love photo archives. I love anything that has original material. Right now I'm working on a project involving baseball. So I'm using a lot of sports facts. Interestingly enough, the things that interest the fantasy guys don't help me with my cataloging of photographs. So it's good information presented in a very simple, straightforward way. I'm usually not looking at websites for new ideas. I'm really looking at them for information, and lots of it, great depth.
Okay.
I'm an archivist. I like archives.
Here's a question that just came in on the Twitter feed, and I'm going to ask you this question, then I'm actually going to bounce it to Sarah. What are some ways that you make your websites interactive with the viewer?
The most important is that we actually, with every image, we provide visitors opportunities to tell us about the images, and whether it's through an email or some other way of getting information to us directly. And what's been important to these people is not just that they send us the information, but they love to see it then reflected on the website a week later. And we promise people, if you send us new information, we'll get it up in a week. And that's been critical. When we do audio recordings, we're going to be putting those on as well.
Excellent. Sarah, can you give our students some suggestions of ways that makes their websites more interactive to their judges, but also to anybody who's going to view it?
Yeah, and I think that for History Day students, we don't have the opportunity to create a dialogue so much with the History Day website, just given the parameters of the category. What I think has been effective is when I see students using the website more than just an exhibit on the computer. And I think that they can do that through video or the simple act of being able to click on a newspaper article, have it blow up, and then I can actually read it. I think that that's when I've seen some really effective stuff. It's not just putting it on there again to be pretty, but putting it on there as evidence. Sometimes students fall into the trap of putting things that are sort of fun and games on there and thinking that they're interactive, so they put a crossword puzzle, a word search, and I think that kind of misses the point. And so I would shy away from that sort of stuff as interactive elements.
Excellent. Here's another question from Twitter. A student asked, how do you show continuity within a website while avoiding repetition, without making every page look like the last page? What are some tips that you might have, Dr. Lippincott?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think that if you're different, one of the things is if your different pages have different functions, they can look different. The design of each page should be adapted to the content you're trying to deliver on that page. So with Teenie Harris, we have a couple of key colors, but we use those colors in different ways to guide people through the website, for example. Format, images of a certain size, information of a certain size. Big letters are important things, small letters are less important. And it can be very simple, and keeping it consistent can be really helpful to the user.
Excellent. I have more questions coming in. Forgive me, I'm looking at two computer screens at the same time. A student just asked, should you directly state your purpose, your argument, your thesis statement? And what are some ways you can help guide a reader to understand exactly the point of view that you're trying to make? What kinds of suggestions what you have for that student?
I think a couple of strong opening statements at the beginning of the website are really important. We try never to have more than 2 or 3 sentences at most, because people don't like to read on the web, or at least that's our experience. They want to get right into whatever it is you've got. So a couple of strong statements or a question will get people going.
Okay, here's another question. Should I put music on my website? And if so, if I choose to put a piece of music, should I keep it running? What would you say from a web viewer's perspective?
Music can really add a huge element to any series of visual images. I mean, it's time-based, so suddenly you're committed to a certain length of time for people to hear this music. It can create a mood. It can suggest a historical time period and a historical moment. We've used them in combination with images. We've gotten people in tears with this kind of a combination. It can be very powerful. It has to be historically appropriate. And you have to remember that a piece of music that really moves you, the website developer, might not have the same impact on everyone else who's going to look at your website. So be very, very careful how you choose it. But like the idea of working with a different language, it can just provide an important experience for the web user that you can't get in any other format.
Okay. Here's a question that came in about font. We always say to students, your font should be readable. But what are some things that would make a font difficult to read for a viewer on a website that might be different than if I printed it out on a piece of paper?
Color, contrast, size of type, and style of type. We do an awful lot with fonts here at the museum. We've discovered that anything that's very, very fancy or, interesting enough, very, very simple, people get really tired of reading those really quickly. So I would say stay away from the extremes. If you're working on a historical period, it can be fun to find a font that was invented at the same time as the period you're studying. And you can also use maybe one or two different fonts for different parts of the website or to distinguish different aspects of it. If you're going to quote an 18th century writer, you might want to use an 18th century typeface, and then your ideas could go in a very much more modern typeface.
Excellent. I actually have a Hangout question I'm going to pass to Sarah. The question is, the student is asking if I'm making an argument, should I address the counter-argument to that, or should I just leave that by the side and go with my point of view? What advice would you give this student?
I think if you look at the actual History Day judging criteria, as I flip back in here, let's see here. I think you're even addressing balance and perspectives in your research, and so I think you may end up needing to acknowledge that counter argument, but I don't think that you're going to spend your time disproving it. You're going to provide a wealth of evidence in support of yours, but you really only have your 1,200 student-composed words for your website, and so the bulk of your words will probably be dedicated to proving your own argument rather than addressing the counter-argument.
Excellent. That also connects to another question that came in, and the question was, Dr. Lippincott, our students are limited to 1,200 student-created words. So if they were to choose, let's say, a primary source quote from a newspaper article, that wouldn't count. But that they're words that they're creating their argument. And the student asked, do I have to use all 1,200 words? What advice would you give this student?
My advice to this student and all the students is to use as few words as possible. And so don't feel obliged to use
some good ways to get away from, because a lot of times when students start writing, they fill up those 1,200 words very quickly. What would be some suggestions you would give them in order to edit their words and still make their point?
Well, I've found that the best way to use the words you're allowed is to create a sort of position statement at the beginning of the website saying, here's what this is about, here's what you need to know to go through the material I'm presenting. Present the material with the captions in an order and a format so that someone who's scrolling through it or clicking through it just through the sequence of activities will get the story, and then provide some kind of conclusion or question or personal statement about it again at the end. But the fun thing about the websites is you've got the visual images, you've got the sound, you've got the voices. Use those. The more effectively you use those, the more convincing and powerful the site will be.
Okay, here's another Twitter question. The student asks, how do you balance between words and media? So pictures or videos or music or links. What suggestions in a good one page of a website? What kinds of suggestions would you give students for balancing both?
I would give primacy to the images. I mean, there's that old cliche, they're worth 1,000 words. I think that's true. Um, and use words to support the story the images tell. So when we did our website and when we do our exhibitions from the website, most of our energy goes into selecting the images, and the words follow in terms of the actual presentation. We spent a lot of words preparing it and planning and thinking about it. The big effort then goes into selecting the exact images that tell the story, and then after we've got the images selected, we add the text, and the text is always supporting the story in the images.
Okay, here's a question that just came in. A student asked, should I use bullet points or sentences? Can you talk about some ways that a student could use bullet points effectively in text, and sometimes where they might want to use full sentences?
Bullet points can get a bunch of ideas across really, really quickly and efficiently, and they don't require a whole lot of concentration or reading. And so if you just want to give people the bare basic minimums, by all means use bullet points. Sentences you can use to discuss ideas that are a little more complicated, where your choice of words, your grammar, and your syntax will actually affect the meaning and the way people understand it.
Okay, here's another great question that just came in. Should I make my website in black and white or in color? And I think that's a question that students do ask. And then the next question was, what color should I use? But could you talk about some things that are effective to use black and white, and sometimes when you might want to use more color?
If the images and visual material you're working with was originally in black and white, you'd better stick with that. But your surrounding colors and your framing colors and your interventions could then be a bright color. You can use color to help people understand what's original, what's new, what's yours. So I would say if your images and material are in color, use that color. And then make sure that the colors you add to the website support and complement the original material. You always want the original material to look best, and you don't want your other aspects of your website to overwhelm it.
Okay, here's a question I'm going to bounce to Sarah. A student asks, do captions count towards the word count? Could you explain to students what counts towards that 1,200 word student-created word count and what would not?
When we're looking at the student-created word count, we are counting what is really your interpretation. And so that's going to count both the text you write in paragraphs or bullet points, as well as captions. Now, what doesn't count are credits, and that's what we were talking about, where you're giving the attribution to where something came from. So if you're saying that the photo was from the Minnesota Historical Society, that's not going to count. But if you're explaining how this political cartoon demonstrates some greater principle, that is going to count in your word count. As a weird caveat for the website category, your menus don't count. So your titles on each page don't actually count in your word count, because then we'd have to count it for every page, and that would be quite problematic. So those are sort of a bigger picture. But as far as kind of keeping it in mind, think about what you're writing and what's your interpretation versus what really isn't. So.
And I know here's a question that a lot of students ask. Do they really count the words? So Sarah, can you tell us, do they really count the words?
I will honestly admit that every time I judge a website, I copy the words, I paste it into a Word document, and I do a word count. I think it's an important rule, and it's a fairness issue. So this judge does.
Excellent, thank you. Here's one more question from Twitter. A student asks if you're working with a topic that has some content that people might find objectionable. So for your example, if you're looking at something that has an images that might be violent in one form or another, how do you choose what kinds of images to use and what kinds of images to maybe say, you know what, I don't really want to put this in my website, that I don't necessarily need to show this? Dr. Lippincott, what suggestions would you give this student? I'm sorry, I have to ask a question to my friends at NEH. Can you hear Dr. Lippincott? I just lost my audio. No, okay.
we couldn't hear either.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. I got muted all of a sudden. So the question was about violent or difficult imagery and when do you use it and when not. Some stories require that you use it. We've had some interesting situations with the Teenie Harris Archive where we have photos of murders. There are cases where there have been photos of lynchings and other things that are just terrible to look at. If it is absolutely necessary to your story, include the photograph. If it is not necessary to your story, but if you think it might shock people into looking further, I would say don't use it. If it's necessary to the story, then people will accept it. You have to be very careful about how you caption it and the context you show it in, because these photographs can be very interesting to some people and very offensive or disturbing to others.
Okay, I have a question from a student that just came in that said, okay, I'm working on a topic where photographs and even paintings are scarce. What suggestions might you give that student for finding imagery that he or she could use in their website?
Photographs
older topics
are scarce. Older topics. Whew, well, everything is on the internet. I do an awful lot of visual research on the internet, and some of these sites will allow you to download prints, maps, paintings, photographs, you name it. You know, the Library of Congress website is an incredible resource for visual materials, for example. So the internet is a really good source. You have to be careful how you use the images, but it is possible. Your other option is to take your digital camera and photograph things yourself, depending on your subject matter.
Excellent. We have about 2 more minutes for questions. Are there any students in any of our classrooms who have a question they've come up with? If you have one, just raise your hand. Mr. Sato, go ahead.
Hi. Being a judge as well, my question is, especially I think maybe Sarah in Minnesota and Viking Town, because I'm a Viking fan, but how long should a web page be? Because I've seen web pages go on and on and on, and then you go to the next section and you click on it, and it goes on and on and on. And I know Dr. Lippincott, you talked about more, but you also talked about keep it precise. Yeah. So as far as what do judges look for in terms of each page? I know we talked about balance, but just for my students' sake, you know, is there a certain criteria you look at per page, or the design?
I think for me, am I on, Kim?
Yes.
Or Lynn? Okay. I think that for me as a judge, I want to see the students having done some thoughtful editing. And so I don't want to scroll and scroll and scroll and see their entire bibliography represented on the website. I think that on a page, the most effective ones I've seen have maybe been like 2 screens worth as you scroll, because I think that at some point the student needs to divide it up, create a new page, or simply just pick the best evidence and not put all of the evidence on the web page. Sometimes too much information in a 1,200-word website is the student gets lost in there, and so their own argument and their own analysis becomes overwhelmed with pictures and quotes and clips from things. So I think I do advise a bit of editing on their part.
Thank you.
Excellent. Any more questions from our live students? West Catholic, go ahead.
I know we've got one. The students were asking earlier about if they wanted to do part of their page in another language, how that works with like the word count and the like, because what the topic that they're doing, it's a comparison of like French and Spanish and English, and they thought it would be interesting to show that. Does that count towards the word count, especially if, like, they want to retype something? Do they lose anything in that?
That question actually came to me earlier, and the answer that I was given was that if a direct translation is made, so let's say there is one paragraph in Spanish matched up exactly with the translation in English, it would only count once, and the English version would count. This is one of those things where I would suggest to the students, where, kind of echoing what Sarah said and what Dr. Lippincott said, this is where editing comes in. Decide what's most important, decide what we really need to see, and then use the tricks and the techniques that Dr. Lippincott talked about to make that happen, to make it clear what we need to see and what really your point is in putting this document or this particular quote, what you'd like us to see. Brownsburg, do you have any other questions? I don't want to not give you your chance. Go ahead.
Yes, we do. Should we assume that our website viewer will view our tabs in order, or should we make each of our tabs an isolated page of information that you don't necessarily need to visit the tabs before to understand what's on the page?
Okay, well, let's ask that both to our expert and also to our coordinator. So, Dr. Lippincott, what would you say when you build a website? Do you assume that your readers will go in some sort of a logical order, or do you build pages separately?
We assume they're going to do anything they feel like, and so we try to make we assume that they will not follow directions and that they will hit up on the subjects they're interested in and ignore the stuff they're not. So we are pretty much random access in terms of the way we think about our web pages.
Okay. Sarah, what would you tell the student?
Well, History Day website is slightly unique in that the judges are going to have to talk to you at some point, and hopefully they will have looked at every web page that's out there so they can ask you good questions. And so obviously they're given the URL of your homepage first, so we have the impression they start there. From my own personal viewing habits, I tend to follow along, and I tend to move in order, but I'm not guaranteed to. So while I wouldn't guarantee on them clicking through perfectly sequentially, I wouldn't also worry that they are not going to visit half your website. I think that your judges are going to be pretty good about looking at the website as a whole.
Excellent. Well, I have to say I've been very impressed with the level of questions, both from our live students and from our Twitter feed. And at this point, I would like to thank Dr. Lippincott for spending her time this evening in talking with us and engaging with our students and answering lots of questions from all different kinds of places. And on behalf of National History Day, we were very, very excited. We're entering our contest season. Students are starting to compete at their school, at their regional. The state and affiliate contests are coming up, and we're planning for our national contest, which starts June 15th in College Park. At this point, I'm going to turn our hangout over to Karen Kenton at the NEH for a conclusion.
Many thanks again to all our guests and participants. I think this has been a fantastic hangout. If you'd like to know more about NEH or the Chronicling America Prize or tap into our Edcitement resources, please visit NEH.gov. And Dr. Lippincott, thank you so much. I can't tell you how valuable this hangout has been. Thank you.
It has been a pleasure.
Well,
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap things for the evening. And keep in mind that this will be available on nhd.org/hangouts, not only live version, but also we'll archive it on YouTube and on SchoolTube if you or your friends missed it tonight. Thank you so much, and good night from College Park, Maryland.
Night.